Okay, I think we can make a start. Welcome everyone, thanks for your interest in this first event of a series of events that aims to, sorry, I will just enable live transcription. That is the first event in a series of forthcoming events that aim to sort of showcase, celebrate the Counterspace section of the journal Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society. The title for this event today is Psychoanalysis, Bodies and Diet Culture. We have two really fantastic speakers today who I'll introduce in a minute. The sort of kind of layout of this event or how we have structured is we're going to have we start with two papers, then there's going to be a sort of dialogue between Andrew and Molly that I'll chair, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience as well. Before we go into the topic itself, I'll briefly hand over to Angie Boela, who is the editor together with Michael O'Loughlin of Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, who will say a few words about the journal. And then I will also say a few words about the Counterspace section that these two papers have been published in. Angie.
Hi, everyone. I just want to extend a warm welcome to everyone. It's so lovely to see so many of you here. Andrew and Molly, so fantastic to put faces to names and the excellent work that was published in the journal. I will let Jacob talk about the Counterspace section in more detail. Indeed, Counterspace is the brainchild of Jacob, Lara, and the previous co-editor of the Counterspace section, Danica Sabide, who was later on replaced by Nick, joined the team later on, and he's now part of it. It's a fantastic section which aims to promote work that does not usually make it in articles that need to be academic or up to certain standards of presentation, not less footnoted or less academic powerful in terms of content, but alternative in style and possible audiences. PCS is expanding and thriving, and it's a collective effort. Jacob, Lara, and Nick are very much part of it. We now have 4 sections, the traditional original articles, as they were called before me and Michael or anyone else took over. Counterspace, which gave rise to this event, plus another 2 events down the line. One of the most popular and expanding sections. A new space called Lamella, or Lamella if you prefer, which deals with environmental issues from a psychoanalytic perspective, and our book revision section, which is expanding into reviews. That's a revision, I mean reviews, a book review session, which is expanding to film reviews and all kinds of reviews of work as well. So a warm welcome from me, and back to Jacob.
Thank you, Angie. Thanks. I will briefly say a bit about Counterspace before introducing Molly and Andrew and then handing over to them. So Counterspace, Angie has also briefly just mentioned it, is edited by myself. I'm based at St. Mary's University in the UK. Lara Shiha, who is based at George Washington University in the USA, and Nick Malherbe, who is based at the Institute for Social and Health Sciences at the University of South Africa. And the idea behind Counterspace, and I think this will really come to the fore today brilliantly in those 2 papers that we'll be hearing today. The idea is that Counterspace encourages and invites contributions that creatively take up the relationship between the psyche and society, as the journal does more generally, but we pay special attention to theoretical, practical or applied psychoanalysis, and imagining it as an avenue for psychoanalytic submissions that may counter hegemonic narratives within the field, for example, through kind of creative explorations of psychoanalysis as a theory, as a research methodology, as a clinical practice, as a system for thinking about culture, society, the body, political economy, social movements, institutions, and power. We encourage voices of often marginalized or suppressed communities along lines of race, gender, sexuality, gender identity, class, ability, or immigration status, both outside of academia and inside academia. And we're especially interested in work that kind of works against the split of the clinic and the socio-political, and instead examines or challenges the intersections between multiple dimensions of identity, systems of oppression, and novel approaches to research, solidarity, and coalition building. So that's very much what Counterspace is about, and I think that's also really what these two fantastic papers are about by Molly and Andrew, that we're going to hear more about today. So we're really, really excited, really pleased that both of you could join us for this event. I'll introduce you now before handing it over to you. We'll start with Andrew, because that's also how the sort of dialogue in the journal itself sort of has, was sort of set in motion. Andrew's paper was following reviews. It was published, and then Molly wrote a response to that, and we're sort of following that today. So Andrew Dickson is a senior lecturer in the School of People, Environment and Planning at Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. His main areas of interest include Lacanian psychoanalysis, critical health studies, and increasingly the sociology of diagnosis. In 2010, his son Ben suffered a brain injury during his birth as a result of poor decision-making by a range of clinicians. Ben's injury is a focal point for his current scholarship, which involves trying to write an auto-theory account of neonatal encephalopathy and its associated discontents. And Andrew's paper today discusses weight cycling and also sort of combines Lacanian psychoanalysis with auto-theory. Molly Merson is a psychotherapist, teacher, clinical supervisor, and advanced candidate in psychoanalysis at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. Molly lives and works among Lysian, Ohlone, Suisun, and Coast Miwok people's ancestral homelands. Molly is a sometime competitive strongman athlete, weightlifter, which also will show in which is also what the paper is about, gardener, writer, and studies decolonial abolition and socio-ecological community practices. Molly has published 2 journal articles, The Whiteness Taboo, Interrogating Whiteness in Psychoanalysis, and Purposive Encounters with Lack in Strength, Sports, and Diet Culture, which is the article that we're going to hear more about today. That's enough from me. Thanks again. We are so pleased. It's a real honor that you can share, your ideas with us, further thoughts, and I'll look forward to hearing more now. Thanks. We'll start with Andrew.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Andrew Dickson aho. Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along. I really appreciate the interest in my work. A little earlier we were chatting, and I was just saying to Molly that I was terrified, or New Zealand would say shit scared. I was terrified about the response that I might get to this piece of writing, and I was just so overwhelmed with the paper that Molly has written. I think it's incredibly important and covers so much ground, so many important, deeply rooted and connected concepts that I was really quite stunned. I still am, actually, when I was rereading this over the course of the last few days. I write auto theory, so I'm going to talk a lot about me. And I have this conflict whenever I'm talking about me, because the academy doesn't really want me to exist. You know, it wants me to be a scholar and to talk about theory. It doesn't really want me to be Andy. So this paper that's published, I've been writing this for 12 years, and I still think it's writing me. And that kind of concept, that interlinked nature of me, my kids, what's happened to me in life, and where I live, are all inextricably intertwined. So I'm currently, it's what is it, 7:46 in the morning in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm in a tiny little town called Aotearoa, which is on the foothills, of a range called the Rock and Pillar Range, which is in Te Waiponamu, which is the South Island of New Zealand. For those people who have not been here, this is sort of Lord of the Rings territory. Our environment is rocky, sort of barren, snow-capped mountain sort of deal. I'm incredibly privileged to be able to live here. We moved here last year in November from the town where Massey University is originally situated, which is on the North Island of New Zealand, in a town called Palmerston North. We moved here because Ben, my now 12-year-old, was barely clinging to education in a sort of provincial city. There was just too much going on. It was too big. So we moved to this tiny town with a very small school and family support around, which has just been fantastic. And we've also managed so far to avoid the SARS-CoV-2 to date, though I don't know how much longer that's going to happen given what's happening in Aotearoa at the moment. So that is a way of introduction. I'm a Pākehā New Zealander. Many of us will, Pākehā New Zealanders will call ourselves tangata tiriti, which means people of the treaty. We're here by virtue of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. So the indigenous people of Aotearoa, the Māori, many different iwi and hapu, which can be talked about as tribes. They were here long before my ancestors. I was just saying to Molly earlier that all four of my grandparents were born in Aberdeen in Scotland. So I very much talk about my whakapapa, my ancestry as coming from that part of the world. I was born here. I was born in a tiny town in the North Island called Raumati, which means literally summer. It's a beach community, very beautiful place, very privileged upbringing. Both my parents were teachers. I had one older brother who's a professor at a university. I've had all of the privileges that people can have in life: education, no poverty, health access. People listen to me because I'm a big white man, and I've got glasses in education, and they just listen to me. And that privilege is something that was lost on me until I was probably in my early 20s. And then I sort of became very aware that the place I was living and the people and the environment and my gender were all kind of combining to create a whole lot of tension, stress, anxiety, and I was really struggling with that. So I kind of came to psychoanalytic theory through my own issues with understanding my place in the world. That's never left me. I'm still there. I think probably most of us still are. But as I went through my kind of education, I came to this point that I felt like I couldn't really practice scholarship outside of the auto. I couldn't really do scholarship without being in it. I just felt that break as too much for me. So I wrote my PhD using autoethnography as a method. It was probably one of the first Lacanian autoethnographies, which was a real challenge in terms of the approach and the connections and all of that stuff that goes with that. When I was rereading Molly's paper earlier this week, I saw again the connection that Molly made between auto theory and indigeneity. And this is not something that is lost on me. This is a really interesting understanding. As tangata tiriti in Aotearoa, the concept of indigeneity is incredibly important to me. You know, the recognition about the impact that settlers have had on this country that I call home, and my connection to that is not lost on me. And one way that I think I can explore that is through this idea of auto theory, of using the auto and really interrogating the interior of the subject. So I did this through my PhD work, and this paper has basically arisen out of that, which is why it's been 12 years in writing. So biomassochism, the act of punishing oneself with one's biomass and enjoying it, usually involving bathroom scales, is something I first kind of talked about, 10 years ago, jokingly, when I was talking to people who I would previously have described, or currently would describe, as weight anxious. And the reason I did that is I wanted to connect this concept of the requirement of our crazy capitalist system of production to produce, people who are simultaneously losing and gaining, and then to be disappointed in themselves all throughout that process, disappointed because they're not eating the right food, or disappointed because they're not losing weight fast enough, or disappointed because they're losing it too fast. And that constant anxiety that really fuels the capitalist discourse, the Lacanian capitalist discourse, in that sense, that kind of infinity loop that doesn't have that break that we would see in the discourse of the university, or the discourse of the hysteric. So that kind of infinity, that loop, which always has you, is, I think, best exampled when you look at the institutional investors of the Weight Watchers group and McDonald's, for example, because they're the same institutional investors, about 10% crossover, where big money knows that it makes money whenever it's got people worried. And that kind of thing for me really grabbed hold of me early on, and I wanted to really explore that tension in myself and how it operates and how it works. So the other thing that I think is kind of core in terms of this paper is the kind of queering of gender, queering of sexual identity. I kind of have always found the notion of gender amusing. So I don't mean that in any way to undermine it, but it feels to me both hyper real and also obviously false simultaneously. Hyper real because it's so, those of you in America the Tucker Carlson little video thing that's been on the internet lately would be an example of this. Is kind of like hyper real and obviously ridiculous, you know, simultaneously. And my wife Anna, who's a psychotherapist, always says to me, if something seems so real, like it's really real, then you know that it's not real. And what she's doing there is playing with that Lacanian concept of something in the real, which is obviously imaginary, which is also very real, you know, with a small r. So that idea of gender for me has always been very interesting, because I'm a heterosexual white man. I've been with my wife Anna in a relationship since I was 16. We met at school and we just fell in love, and that's just it. You know, I have this example of saying my dating experience consists of saying yes to one woman once, and that's it. It's always been kind of really odd to me, this idea of a man in the world. You know, I found that really strange. So engaging with that concept of gender and thinking about that in relation to weight has always been a core part of my kind of work, because the way I write appeals really strongly to people for whom weight is an issue, and people for whom weight is an issue in our society are commonly ascribed the gender of female, because they are just put under a different set of rules as men, as males. So the other thing that I wanted to do also is in this paper, which is the auto theory part, is to try and practice, you know, that kind of auto theoretical writing. I was really inspired here by Maggie Nelson's book, The Argonauts. If you've not read that text, it's the first thing I suggest you do. Just it's an incredible piece of work, the way that she works with theory, the way theory is in her and she's in it. I was incredibly inspired by. So I wanted to try and do that kind of thing. And it felt to me like this idea of la langue, you know, this, I can't, my Kiwi accent is going to prevent me speaking French at all usefully, especially for those of you who know the language. So this idea of the language, the mother tongue, as Lacan has kind of said in the past, this idea of that language that you don't have access to but fully informs you, that runs, you know, runs the ship. Trying to get that out was what I did in that section called From the Biomassochism. So there I'm not actually trying to write for a paper. I'm just trying to write. And I think that probably was the biggest challenge from an editorial perspective, because the way I like to play with language and work language in that area just doesn't fit well with academic publishing, which is why I was so happy that I managed to engage enough to be able to get it into the journal, to have some people read it, because that I think is such a critical part of work. And I just want to read this. So this is a paragraph here from Lacan Seminar 20, Encore, and I'm using here the Gallagher translation of that. So this is from the seminar on the 21st of November 1972. So I'm going to quote, "Language is what we try to get to know about the function of la langue. This indeed is how scientific discourse tackles it, except that it is difficult for it to fully realize it, for the unconscious bear witness to knowledge that for the most part escapes the individual, who provides the occasion to realize just how far the effects of la langue go. Now, for me, this is the kind of crucial bit of what I'm trying to achieve here, is that you get so much more with that kind of with that kind of writing. Language obscures la langue. That's kind of the problem. It's a wall of language, you know, but it is also the only thing that we can express ourselves in a forum like this. So that's a huge challenge, I think, to scholarship, you know, just to scholarship broadly. You write and you are obscuring, you know, how do you deal with that? So that's a core part of what I'm trying to achieve. I don't think I resolve that in any way. I'd be impressed if someone can. And I also really wanted to stop the demonization of weight cycling. So weight cycling, yo-yo dieting, losing weight, gaining weight, is such a thing that is trashed in all areas of our discourse, you know. The body positivity area, even the fat acceptance area, certainly the scientific discourse, even in the social science discourse, there's just a uniform trashing of it. You know, we don't talk about people shedding weight for events in a positive way at all. We just describe bad to that. And I just wanted to, as a professional weight cycler, I really just wanted to pull back and say, hang on, what is this doing? Like, what is it actually doing? And that's where I got to this concept of the maintenance of desire. You know, it's not about the maintenance of weight loss, it's about maintaining desire. So the fat body is a body that is infused with desire. It has potential, you know, kind of like a drawn bow. It is powerful, it is engaged, it makes people, you know, sit up, it wants to be seen, to be understood. And then you lose that weight, it's kind of like deflating, you know, you get to a point and then you think, okay, now I have to maintain this. And then all of the whole discourse, you know, you go to your doctor and they say you need to maintain. And I'm, you know, highly successful at maintaining weight loss and also highly successful at not maintaining it. And that kind of immense pressure, which I think, but also this kind of loss, you know, that this really felt lack that inhabits the kind of your being in that process, I think is something that we really need to pay attention to. And that's why I kind of hinge that last part of the paper on the repetition, I think, that's inherent in desire. If there's any part of Lacan that you want to take forward, and, you know, there's a lot of Lacan that's been de-Lacanized, always read the original text, please, if you can. Read it in French if you can read French. I can't, wish I could. Desires. That concept, that idea of the building, the repetition, the enacting of the subject, to me, that's where so much of the power inherent in that, in the Lacanian understanding of the world can be, and that in the inherency of the subject. I just want to finish. I'm going to finish now, but I wanted to kind of draw attention to the work that I'm doing at the moment, which is around, as Jacob was saying, an auto-theoretical account of neonatal encephalopathy. Neonatal encephalopathy is basically brain injury in babies. There's, in Aotearoa, there's a kind of strong, almost like a rejection of the idea that this happens. So we certainly accept it when it's obvious, but there's a lot of issues around pregnancy and birth that are overlooked in this area. So I'm trying to work on that, and the support for people who have children who are brain injured, or for people who were brain injured as children but have then grown up and become complicated adults and are then given a whole range of diagnoses that all stem from this kind of early interaction. I really want to work on that. That's the area. And the Lacanian sort of text that I'm kind of in at the moment around that is seminar 10, which is the seminar on anxiety. There's this really beautiful kind of elaboration of the Freudian concept of inhibition, symptom, and anxiety that I'm drawing on, and the axes of that are, which are translated as difficulty in movement, and the relation to the sort of magnitude of the signifier. So that's the kind of work I'm really interested in at the moment, and how that relates to how we understand people who are, I guess you'd say, the disabled community more generally. Okay, weird place to end, but that is where I'd end. And I also would just like to thank Molly so much for the wonderful engagement that her paper is with mine.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. And Molly, would you like to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. It was, I'm really honored to have been able to respond to your paper. And I'm even thinking about, some of the things you're saying now about gender and language. I was just talking to some folks yesterday about gender and how hard it is for me to find a word for my gender. So, I want to think more about that, right? But it feels very up and fresh for me. I have something prepared that I'm going to read, and hopefully it's interesting and not too dry when folks read. Okay, I'm just going to make sure I can see folks. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to read something that's pretty loosely based on my paper. I'm not sure if folks were able to read it or not, but this is kind of what I'm writing about and what I'm thinking about in response to Andrew, and also in response to my life and being in it. Strength sports are at their apex a performance. Most athletics in some way or another embody performative elements. The athlete trains for a sport and enacts it, often enacting the sport during the training itself. As an amateur strongman athlete who's also a psychoanalytic candidate, clinical psychotherapist, and clinical supervisor, I live among several overlapping realms: the psychic, the emotional, the environmental, the sociopolitical, the bodily, and the interwoven reveries and experiences that exist between all. Performance expresses itself differently in the clinical realm than it does for an activist or on the lifting stage, but all these realms require the participant to show up with full capacity, having undergone practice, commitment, and consistency, in order that, in Sarah Ahmed's words, the subject does what they say they will do. Training for competitions in lifting sports is a very intense experience. I've trained for several low-stakes competitions in varied strength sports where the win was primarily the experience rather than the prize. One of my favorite events encouraged athletes to compete by offering stuffed dinosaurs as prizes. Even so, sometimes exercise has been laborious, sometimes it's been fun, at times it's been a drag, and at times a punishment for libidinal desires. Because of the culture in which I was raised and my identifications with it, I experienced significant psychic and physical embeddedness within diet culture, which sort of requires a kind of sense of control over one's body. It's taken me several decades to learn how to receive nourishment, how to have reciprocity, and how to engage in the type of movement that allows me access to vitality rather than collapsing my psyche. When I entered the realm of strongman sport, I did so because of my lifelong fascination with the idea of lifting heavy and odd objects. I'd spent a lot of my young life playing many sports, mostly the solo ones, track and field, gymnastics, swimming. Once my body started changing during puberty, I started to feel disconnected from sport and from my body. And only later did I pick up running again. As an adult, I have found a bit more access to competition and aggression and have competed as an amateur in CrossFit, Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, and strongman. Strongman has been the sport that has stuck, at least for now. Strongman has been described as lifting heavy, odd objects for fun. Among the implements of the sport are kegs, cars, axles, tires, and stones. Athletes carry hundreds of pounds on a yoke for short distances. We drag trucks, we push boats, we lift rocks, we throw kegs and bags of sand. We have an implement called an Atlas stone, a large round concrete stone that we either hoist onto a platform, hurl over a bar, or roll up to our shoulders, mimicking the Titan Atlas, who carried the world and the heavens on his shoulders. These types of field sports involve farming and manual labor elements, and although an athlete can certainly purchase expensive equipment, it's not a requirement for participation. Anything that can be lifted, dragged, thrown, held, and or carried may be attempted, and great efforts will be made to lift things that don't seem particularly suited to respond to human force. Athletes do this because it's enjoyable and strange, and because we want to challenge our bodies to do something unexpected, which ultimately challenges our minds and our beliefs about who we are and who we're culturally marked to be. Training for these competitions, however, can require a type of fixation and rigidity of schedule, exercises, and restrictive diet that doesn't often equate to the free association of play. That said, there are moments in training where the sheer intensity of the lift requires the subject to fully arrive and focus on the task at hand to the exclusion of all else, sometimes in their garage or driveway, and often in community spaces. Training can become a space of reverence and obsession, where there is a task at hand to accomplish a certain number of sets, a certain number of repetitions of a certain activity at a certain weight. In strength sports, the lifts may last for mere seconds. Upon completion of a lift, we'll turn to each other and cheer each other on or commiserate about a failure. And ultimately in strongman sport, the final culmination is the competition, a day or weekend-long space of arrival, intensity, community, and play. The jouissance in the heavy lifting is in our bruises, sore muscles, our failures, and the moments that we recognize we didn't believe in ourselves, but we did the thing anyways. These are demonstrations and reminders of these purposive moments of joyful action or painful failure. Zeroing an event in strongman, meaning that the athlete fails to make the lift at all, is not unusual, and one can still win the competition if one zeros one event. It's a strange feeling when entering a competition to admit that I'm willingly signing up to likely fail if the implement weights are way out of my range. In strength sports, the jouissance lies in the purpose being the competition, but the competition itself is fleeting, momentary, and full of failure. Here, failure is part of the territory. And yet we keep coming back, the doing of something over and over again in training, and at times actually achieving positive results in competition or practice is a wish fulfillment of the most gratifying order. It can also bring athletes a sense of agency and subjectivity, which is vital, in particular for people who often experience state and gender violence because of the way their bodies are seen and positioned by the world. As strongman athletes, we're invested in the thrill of mass moving mass. We find ourselves surprised and excited by odd objects and our potential relationship to them. Nearly every object we encounter in our lives generates the question, could I lift that? Thus, the lifter becomes an active subject of her own physical and psychic life. In white supremacist, classist, patriarchal societies such as the United States, those with bodies interpolated as female are socialized from preconception to take on the projections of a society which often insists on physical and psychic smallness in women. I argue that cis female, trans men and women, and genderqueer lifters, just by nature of existing, are positioned to subvert this social messaging. For example, a well-known female strength athlete has "take up space" tattooed on her thigh, claiming for herself and her thighs the right to exist in space. She only has to make this claim because she's been repeatedly instructed to do otherwise. The oppressive effects of racialized patriarchy are not limited to women, femme, genderqueer people. An individual with a body interpolated as male is also subjected to a particular gaze intent on boxing in his body. For example, the idealized white man is typically expected to be muscular, hard, and solid, but not too threatening. And a man whose body does not fit that form may likewise be positioned to subvert a normative expectation of a male form. This shifts too when considering Black subjectivity, where manhood is denoted as violent by the very society which projects its violence onto Black masculinity and Black life. While the effects of these cultural projections are felt by the individual and often taken on by the individual as a personal fault, these are intentional cultural framings which highlight a narrative that one's identity and value and worth in society can be identified by one's body shape, muscularity, and proximity to and distance from fatness and Blackness. These effects and reproductions are passed along via multi-generational, interpersonal, and cultural projections and projective identifications, and reinforced by social norms and structural limitations, such as the size of seating on airplanes, medical treatment, and other accessibility issues. These norms can enact further violence in the family and social system by reenacting entrenched, internalized, oppressive hierarchies of power between individuals. The notion of social control over body shape and size has deep roots in white supremacy. In her book, Fearing the Black Body, Sabrina Strings describes the medicalization of thinness and dieting, tracing it back to the early 19th century. In large part, Strings argues control over food intake had to do with maintaining white supremacy. In other words, if the white community was fit and well, they could be better, superior colonizers. In this way, religion, gender, body size, and wellness have been utilized to uphold a hierarchy based on skin color, status, class, and affiliation. After all, if bodies in a settler colonial capitalist society are representative of status, access, and identity, a lot is riding on how we look. Throughout her book, Strings links religion, health, and the well body to anti-Blackness, elucidating how the Kellogg Company, known nowadays for its cereal, began by a Seventh-day Adventist doctor promoting the wellness of Anglo-Saxons via food engineering. He was essentially promoting wellness to benefit white people. While Strings notes that Kellogg believed that, quote, it was not excess fat, but excess leanness, resulting from a poor diet that was the existential threat facing Anglo-Saxon women and by proxy the white race, end quote, the threat of the, quote, obese person appeared to be positioned as a danger as well. In 1927, the former president of the American Medical Association warned that, quote, underweight is more dangerous before 30 years of age and overweight after 30, end quote. Coupled with the emergence of the body mass index, an economist's tool utilized as an indicator of health by life insurance companies, anyone's sense of self could easily become delinked from an intuitive relationship between body and mind. How fat is too fat? How thin is too thin? What body is a good enough body? As a patient of mine once reflected in relation to Simone Biles' gymnastics wins and the subsequent rule changes, which prevented her from acquiring even more points for her record-breaking maneuvers. Quote, There's no winning in a game where the goalposts are always moving, end quote. In Andrew's paper, Andrew evokes a deeply rooted, personally and socially charged dilemma in the notion of biomasochism, defined as the act of punishing oneself with one's weight and enjoying it, usually involving bathroom scales. I love that so much. I see myself in it. I'm just saying, no. I hear a reclamation of agency in this statement, a kind of queering of diet culture. It evokes for me my own social location as a white athlete and lifter assigned female at birth who enjoys using my biomass to move other mass around. In thinking about Ahmed's The Uses of Use, I think that in strength sports, I have a chance to become the subject rather than the object of usage, or maybe both. In this irrelevant and at times impossible task of strongman lifting, I experience a libidinal practice of pushing up against an object that also pushes up against me. In this, I find a self, a skin ego, and edges, which I have a say in delineating. Something is being done to me, but by me. The scrapes, bruises, and skin tears that are common in sports like strongman, gymnastics, and roller derby are worn as badges of honor, a kind of pain that has come from effort and pleasure, as though ensuring that we always encounter pleasure as pain, and the paradox of life and death is never resolved. To further queer this notion, when an action is purposive, the question can be asked, what is its purpose, and whether in fact it may be carrying out multiple purposes simultaneously. In strongman, the purpose includes lifting, but the purpose of the sport also becomes one of creating the competitions as spaces and locations in which people gather. One might call them a counterspace to certain traditional sports pitches. From personal experience, competitions can often be friendly and diverse spaces and personally transformative spaces. I've heard a lifter say on more than one occasion she didn't think she had it in her to make the lift, only to perform it and exuberantly claim through tears of joy that it was the single best moment of her life. That said, I take up Deshaun Harrison's push for us to grasp that personal transformation and, as they name it, body positivity is not inherently and on its own a location of social and structural liberation. That is, liberation beyond the individual and intrapsychic. They state in their book, Belly of the Beast, quote, "The body, an entity of sorts, or the flesh we're born into, is not what creates the violence. What creates the violence is an ideology and the power to enforce it interpersonally or systemically. This means that whether or not you love on, show up for, and transform how you view your body, the structure of the world, capital W world, does not shift. This is the harm of body positivity. It cannot produce anything more than a quasi-self-confidence because it, for a long time now, has not been asked to. Body positivity individualizes something that is bigger than the individual," end quote. In addition, much of the biological essentialism that regulates trans and cisgender men and women in sport is tied to both a cis heteropatriarchal demand that women are fragile and men are aggressive, and that women's uteruses will fall out if they run, or people's uteruses, and that women should not have any physical or psychical agency at all. Checking Olympic athlete Caster Semenya's testosterone levels, for example, is explicitly anti-trans and anti-femme. It is also explicitly anti-Black. Perhaps the task before us is to recognize that the odd object, or the 200-pound Atlas stone that we must lift and even smash, is the world, capital W world, itself. That is the world that racial capitalism and cis heteropatriarchy has generated, the world that requires prisons for punishment, the world that accepts poverty as the, quote, natural order of things, unquote. If more of us strong folk and tender folk were willing to use our strength and tenderness as a praxis, to sit with the discomfort of the potently unresolvable paradox that the colonial project has left us with, we may actually find more joy and selfhood in failing the systems that are failing us, that aren't set up for us, or in failing ourselves into a place outside the limits of our current conceptualization of what it is to be human in a more than human world. Maybe then we could take up space with more than our thighs, or maybe we'd find more reciprocity and room for complexity. Maybe our thighs are just the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly. Thank you, Andrew, for two really fantastic summaries, but also, you were really going beyond, I think, both of your articles. So really, really rich talks. Thank you. So before opening it up to everyone for Q&A, we'll have a, some space for the two of you to have a kind of dialogue and conversation between each other. So I was just going to, sort of open it up to where you would like to begin, either. Any responses, any thoughts you might have, freely associate.
my immediate free association is, oh, Molly's paper is so much better than mine. I mean, it's just
that's masochist.
Yes, here we are.
This odd object that needs to be smashed. I just love that. And I immediately thought of the Freudian unheimlich, this idea of the uncanny object.
Yes.
The world, the world that's around us, this capital W that we look at and think, what the fuck? And there's a kind of, so I didn't talk about it much in my initial opening here, but you can see from my paper that I'm a boxer, and I've trained in Muay Thai, kickboxing and boxing for 30 years now. And for me, is the exercise of my body has been such a critical way to kind of engage with the world and understand the world in ways that I think the academic community, at least in Aotearoa in New Zealand, so often doesn't see. So I used to train at a gym in my old regional city, which was a very working class gym, that I would have been the only person there with a graduate education, and one of the only people there with any kind of university education at all. And the reason I trained there is that the interaction with the world outside of the academy gave me a kind of grounding recognition about my own privilege in one sense, but also just what the world does, what this Molly's world, I call it that, the odd object does to people. The kind of, you would probably not believe it, but the Trumpism that has found its way into working class New Zealand lives, where the structure of capitalist ideology has forced people into kind of sustained poverty, intergenerational poverty, and yet at the same time grabs hold of them and wants them to support that kind of structure through that ideology of Trumpism. And what I find fascinating about that is I'm standing in front of that person with my gloves on and a mouth guard in, defending myself as they try and beat the shit out of me. And, I'm if you look at those two images in my article, I'm closer to the bigger one than the small one right now. And, you know, I'm 120 kilograms of man, you know, I'm a big man, and I'm sitting there with my guard up and my gloves on, and I'm absorbing this kind of violent action. And for me, there's a real feeling like that's the exercise of capitalist ideology. It was my job to do that, to absorb it. And I guess one thing I've got very interested in lately is this idea of the martial arts as therapy, and what that means in relation to the interaction between bodies. I often, in my own analysis, I often talked about it as a way for me to have a intimate physical interaction with other men that has been completely precluded from my life, you know, as a white man growing up. And we don't, you know, I don't think I've ever hugged my own father. You know, I shake hands with my brother, and that's just how we interact, you know. The first time I got hugged by a man was a colleague, a Turkish colleague who got a job in the university, and he walked into my office, introduced himself, and hugged me. And I was just a bit like, you know, that stuck kind of, hang on, this is, but then, but in martial arts, you have this intimate physical connection with someone, you know, your body and their body are they're writhing together. It's very, very, like I follow Alenka Suprancic, and I don't know if any of you've read her text, What is Sex? It's a great text, an immense text. And, you know, so there's that kind of interaction, I think, is very human. But the big W world that Molly talks about has given us rules about what you can and can't do in relation to that. And I think we're all trying to push that away, you know, to find some connection in there.
Mm-hmm. And some coming aliveness, right?
Yeah.
Some vitality. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's one thing I'm missing a lot at the moment, having moved down to this other part of the country, because I currently don't have a gym. So I don't have sparring partners, you know, it's just me and my heavy bag. The heavy bag just doesn't respond the same.
Your sport is a little more like mine right now, you know, a little more solo. But I'm also, you know, since COVID, my community does still meet every week, but I've moved. It's about an hour and a half drive to get to the place where people, you know, throw stuff around and play. And even if we don't touch each other, like, you know, it's very different from your sport. We're, you know, breathing our air, we're, you know, sweating on things, and, you know, there's some communal exchange happening. Plus other people can take the weights out, and, you know, you don't have to clean everything up at the end because everybody does it. So, you know, if I want to practice in my backyard, I have to take every single plate out, every single implement, you know, and there is something that is not, it's not the same. It doesn't have the same vitality, the same eros, the same life force to it when it's so solo. And particularly a heavy bag and a body there. Yeah, these kind of substitutes, right? Well, for things that can't be.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, COVID is, you know, you probably have all heard, you know, about New Zealand's, they call it the world leading approach, where we managed to eradicate COVID for a long time until Omicron came on. So basically February this year was the first time we really had it in our community. And my son Ben has cerebral palsy and is really susceptible to respiratory illnesses, and as such we're like really nervous. In fact, today is his first day back at school because we've come over a wave and we're down in a shallow bit at the moment, which hopefully will continue for at least a little while. But I left my gym because of COVID. I had to stop training because of the danger. And it often really resonated with me, this idea of the Lacanian real, you know, the capital R real, and the repetition of viral transmission is, for me, really good proxy to understand the real. You know, that thing that insists, Lacan talks about it being stuck to the bottom of your shoe like toilet paper when you leave the bathroom. You know, it knows where you've been. You know, someone who's had COVID, we know where you've been, and there's that strange, uncanny intimacy, I think, that people are really wrestling with. You know, New Zealand is 2 years behind everyone in that sense. So what I'm dealing with psychically now is probably what many of you were dealing with psychically 2 years ago. So and that's interesting. I mean, we already feel backward down here in the bottom of the world, so far away from everyone. Yeah, not sure what to make of that.
Can I ask a question maybe, and then we can also soon sort of open it up. So it seemed to me that, you know, Andrew, your paper, you know, you talk quite a lot about, you know, desire. You write quite a lot about desire, and Molly, you also you seem to kind of foreground jouissance, you know, more than kind of maybe explicitly desire, and I thought that was quite interesting. But then as I was reading your paper, Andrew, you know, I thought, isn't what you are kind of you know, writing about already? Aren't you already kind of moving in, you know, Lacanian terms, or kind of how Zizek talks about it? Aren't you already moving to this, you know, this subject of the drive? Aren't you already moving kind of away from desire? Because you know, in terms of weight cycling, you know, that's impossible, right? So in a way, to me, you know, your article was all about sort of saying, you know, look, I can never get this object of desire, this sort of ideal weight. It's and you have already sort of moved beyond, you know, desire. You are fully in the sort of drive moment, because you have that reflexivity, you know, and that's actually then ethical for Lacan. You know, that's the sort of next step in a way. And I was wondering what you sort of thought of that. And then also Molly's your paper is maybe also a different way then of sort of, you know, encountering lack and encountering desire, which also, you know, acknowledges sort of that impossibility, but then it didn't have that sort of, you know, masochism element in it. You know, you've got a sentence in there where you're writing the doing of something over and over again and actually achieving positive results can bring athletes a sense of agency and subjectivity. You know, and that I thought that, you know, that sounded great, and that actually, to, you know, that sounds very un-Lacanian to me. You know, that's actually where we're getting somewhere here. So yeah, that's just my kind of thoughts. You know, I was wondering what you thought, what your responses were.
I think I love that. It's hilarious. Just to speak to that piece for me, I come from a place, I think, where so I garden, and I have an incredible garden this year, and it's scaring and overwhelming even me, the size of the way things are growing. Because I plant a seed and I expect the seed to do what it does. The seed does what its seed's going to do. It has all of everything already in it, but I know it's going to die. It's not, I mean, these are vegetables, you know, I'm growing it to eat it. Like, I'm growing it to kill it, right? That's why I'm growing it. So I'm kind of coming from that place of like, And especially this sort of repetition of training, like we just do that, like literally the same thing over and over again. And CrossFit, you know, will argue to mix it up and all these kind of things, general physical preparedness. But in strongman and in order to make a muscle strong, you have to, you know, do the same things over and over. So I think there's something about the desire. Is it a desire of failure, or is it an expectation of failure, expectation of death? And if we kind of can live in that space a little more of like, there's the expectation of death and failure, then I think we can be more, for me, I can be more surprised when I actually, oh, something different actually happens, right? And whether it's growthful or not to like make, you know, your lift, I don't know, you know, you're tired at the end of the day, no matter what, but there's a kind of a thrill to it that is part of the surprise and the unexpectedness. Even though we're practicing every day to succeed, for me, I don't often lead with that. So I think that's kind of what I was trying to describe.
Yeah, so I also, when I was reading Molly's paper, saw a few things which I thought were quite un-Lacanian, which was wonderful for me. I might have even called them, you know, proto-Deleuzian in terms of the vital approach, you know. So, and which I find very interesting, though, I would probably pick up on Lara's comment earlier when she was talking about the some Lacanians really going a long way away from how Lacan may have written those texts. So a lot of that's why I kind of constantly say to people, particularly my students, I say go back and read the text, you know, because Lacan was can be interpreted in multiple ways. I mean, I'm a fervent follower of Julia Kristeva. I think her kind of post-Lacanian feminism is really wonderful, and I'm constantly engaging with that kind of work. But so sort of back to your point about desire drive, and so this is exactly, I think, the crux of what I'm trying to say in that last part of that argument. So, and I'm not settled here. So I'm really playful with this, I think, because one of the things that I think is very alluring about the structure of anorexia, and I'm talking, and I want to be very careful here because I'm talking about not any person, an individual, a subject who has been diagnosed with or is suffering from or has recovered from the disease, the disorder that the ICP and others classify as anorexia. I'm talking more in the terms of the structure of anorexia and the way our society interacts with that, the figure of the anorexic. Because I think Gabriella Ripadomina talks about the drive that bores a hole in her, and she's specifically using the her gender here. It's not a mistake that Ripadomina is using that concept of the her, a drive that bores a hole in her. And I think for the weight anxious, for those of us for whom weight is an issue, we look at the figure of the anorexic, the figure of anorexia, the kind of power that comes with that refusal, you know, that no. And that's kind of like, for me, that you know, 2 fingers up, fuck off, no, that I refuse to engage with this practice. I'm not going to be fed. I'm not going to, right? That kind of refusal is incredibly alluring, I think, for people. I think the body positivity movement has its origins in the desire for that drive. but it is not the drive. That they are, as I think Molly said so gracefully earlier, they're so caught up in that, the ideology of the capitalist desire, that we have that very, so for me, the masochistic element of this is that the cycling element of this is the recognition that we all hate our bodies. We hate them because they don't lift that, or they won't stop peeing themselves after you've had a baby, or I'm just using personal family examples here, or they constantly react stupidly to different types of food, or that you have to try and regulate the amount of alcohol you drink as you get older because you can't stand the headaches anymore, or the fact that the knee is just never better, and the ankle that you rolled up in the mountains 20 years ago that you decided would be fine to walk out on, but turned out to be broken, this is a personal example, will just never heal properly. And you just won't ever get back to the fact that you could run 100 Ks a week and now you can't, your body, you hate it because it just doesn't do what you want it to do. But the capitalist ideology says, of course it can. You're just not working hard enough, or you're eating too much, or you're not eating enough, and then you look at the anorexic who literally says, no, that desire for that drive is very alluring. Now, I'm very careful with this because I've been accused in the past of not accused. People have asked me in the past of whether I'm saying there's something great, there's something very good about anorexia. And this is where I make that direct, distinct connection between the figure of the anorexic, the semblance of it, and the capitalist ideology. Because I think I quoted this at the end. Yeah, I did. So is it the Viggie's paper from 2016, The Modern Capitalist Bulimic? Because the perfect consumer is the one that, eats all the food but doesn't look like it. And that kind of circle, the infinite loop in the capitalist discourse is the thing that is wrong, but it's also the thing that's got us. And the anorexic is not in that. And that, I think, is what's alluring about it, the potential. So I think for me, when I talked about the biomasochist, I'm saying that that person who cycles, weight cycles, you can frame them in terms of the capitalist ideology. You can say, this is the person who's losing weight and then gaining weight and then losing weight and then gaining weight, the perfect consumer. But I think it's actually the maintenance of that attempt to be the anorexic without dying, without the death drive taking over. I think that's actually an attempt to reclaim some kind of life, and that life for me is about losing and gaining weight. So rather than resisting that in my life now, I try and accept that there are times when I'm thinner and times when I'm fatter, and it just doesn't mean in what the capitalist wants it to mean, but I'm I haven't figured out a way to fully fight that yet. My wife Anna has, though. She's an amazing woman. She was very small, had children, gained a lot of weight, doesn't give a shit. She really just doesn't care. I don't know why. She reckons it's because she's kind of mildly autistic and just isn't that, she's got other things to worry about, she said. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. We could now also perhaps open it up to questions from everyone. You can just unmute yourselves, I think, and you can also, if there are lots of questions, you can raise your hand and we'll go through them. I think Angie had a question first.
My question was partially answered when Andrew started talking about masochism and this masochistic looping back and forth. And it occurred to me, two things first. I mean, I'm a very amateur runner and I have nothing to show for my running, but getting drenched and thinking, what the hell am I doing? There is no pleasure like that. And going out for a run on a chilly day, or on the 25th of December, for instance, Christmas Day, instead of staying in and staying cozy, oh, that kicks. It seems to me like either we're all masochists or sport is directly linked and unjustifiably linked with masochism too easily. Well, nothing matters when I are out there, as I said, but I'm really interested in this kind of theorization. Sport, you must be a masochist. It's intuitively does not make sense to me anymore. Molly, I would love to hear from you a bit more.
I mean, I don't quite know what to say, because I even as I was preparing for today, I was realizing, of course, I lifted before this, right? I'm like, I got to get in, you know, what is this actually, this thing I'm doing? And I realize that this is something, it comes back to this mother tongue language piece that you brought in, Andrew, earlier about, I don't really know what to say about it. Like, this theory feels very on the edge. It feels like that skin ego. It feels like this place where you're bumping up against the other person or the object or whatever it is, that there's something that happens in the experience, in the moment, that I don't, yes, it's masochism, but it's not only masochism. You know, I think there's something about the absolutism of it that's doesn't leave room for, you know, I expect the seed to, you know, I expect the plant to die, but it's like, I'm floored by the life of it, right? There's this, yeah, it feels like on the tip of my tongue, but nowhere near my mouth. If that makes sense. Like it's yeah.
I'm totally with you here. So for me, I would go. The thing that I want to say, the association that I want to make is a Te Reo Māori concept called kaitiakitanga, and that's often understood in New Zealand as being the responsibility that we have to the environment or to others, that we must take care of them. But I see it, and not only I, many of my colleagues and friends who understand Te Reo Māori and who live in it, who are Māori, see it also as the way that the environment cares for us.
That's right.
So
yeah.
So so Angie, when you go running on Christmas Day, which I do too you know, but in here, of course, it's summer and warm. Yeah, it does. It's true. But you go running on Christmas, or I go running in the middle of winter in the snow. I have to wear spikes on my shoes because otherwise I'll fall over in the hills, and it's hard. And you feel cold and all that kind of stuff. But what you have with that is the environment interacting with you, taking care of you, being with you. That's that is la langue, in that sense, the mother tongue, the mother being Mother Earth, you know, the mother that is the environment. That's how I would understand it in terms of Te Ao Māori, the world of Māori, because it isn't my actual mother. It's the thing that I'm built of, you know. You're built of the river, you're built of the mountain, you're built of the ocean, you're built of the land, the whenua. That's where I kind of come from. My Māori colleague, Dr. Ihiheki, tells me I have to get back to the Highlands in Scotland because they'll speak to me. And I think that's where a lot of that kind of desire comes from. So as well as that masochistic aspect, you know. Yeah.
Just quick announcement in the chat. So So Jack Black and Joseph Reynoso just put out a call actually in our journal for a special issue on sports and psychoanalysis. So there are many more avenues coming up to explore these issues. And Laura had a question next, I think.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, I'm just makes me so proud to hear you all and think about how we might be encouraging these spaces of inquiry. I don't know about you all, but being in a space like this is worth every conference I've ever been. And this is the aliveness that I crave in our field. So thank you. I mean, what I'm struck by, and I'm wondering if you all could give a little more texture to this, is the relationality of what you're speaking about. Because even if when you speak about individual practice, right, you're also talking about the interconnectivity of a social, economic, political process that bodies engaged in this way, particularly in a capitalist and settler colonial world, can't live outside of, right? So I actually am hearing, even in whether you're running solely, and maybe this is to your question, Angie, is like, that's why it's not just masochistic, right? Is you're connecting to something larger that, yes, has a meaning and a life of its own, but it's also has a particular symbolism. And that's why I appreciate the Deleuzian sort of symbolism as well. But I'm thinking also, and I had mentioned this to Molly at a different point, about how this doing and undoing, whether it's what you all are doing and thinking this through, or your actual act of doing and undoing, whether it's losing weight, gaining weight, or lifting, not all of that is a way that you are working and reworking, right? In a capitalist world where relationships and meanings of those, right, even to our body, are already foreclosed. So for me, it feels like an abolitionist call, right, of how do we move beyond a foreclosed possibility of what this already means, and how do we create and reimagine a world that it's also a very my work is on decoloniality, and I think this is part of what I'm thinking about, because of course, if we don't think about it in that way, and in the relational space you're offering us, it's easy to get trapped in this ableist notion of what bodies are supposed to do, right? I think this is what you're talking about, Andrew, like specific notions of health and wellness. I'm also thinking about, of course, like labor, sex work, of purist notions of what bodies are supposed to do. So they work well in a capitalist world until they don't, because capitalism doesn't even make sense. It has its own contradictions. If capitalism were all about labor and production, then sex work shouldn't be a problem, but it is. And that's the whole, I think that's what I'm hearing you all saying is, can we look and be curious about the larger systems in which these issues are enshrined, and what are the ways in which we undo and redo that over and over and over again? So that's larger commentary, but I'm really also interested in your own sense of like relationality when you talk about these things. Thank you again.
There is something of the internal, like sort of, to Deshaun Harrison's point, maybe a bit, like it's shifting something of my own perspective or my own sort of engagement with my surroundings, right? I think it can liberate, it can go beyond the individual, but only if something else happens. Only if we recognize that the environment is impacting us, we're impacting the environment, and we're responsible. Like there is a reciprocity, I think, that this aliveness, Andrew, back to what you were saying. We care for the earth cares for us, but that none of that is guaranteed. Like the earth can also just, do what it does, and we're not that significant, and yet we are. And so I don't know, but I was just thinking about like that we can, in my sport, I said something about anything that can be lifted will be attempted, right? And it does shift sort of how we engage with the environment. Then if we're looking at things from a particular perspective, which is what capitalism has us do, is looking at things from a particular economic extraction perspective. Oh, can I take that and extract it and make money from it, and et cetera. And then you have, sex work, like you were talking about, which, somehow falls outside of those parameters.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, I'm thinking too about this, the idea of the role that the environment plays in capitalist production. We have a river that runs through the valley that I'm living in, which is from a Te Ao Māori perspective is the kind of the vein. You know, these are the veins of the earth. They carry life, and this river has been extracted to the point of, so 75% of the water is taken out of that river every day for irrigation for dairy in the valley that I'm living in, which is the driest part of Aotearoa, which is not a dry country, but it is a very dry area here. We have about 60 millimeters of rain a year. So that's quite low in context. So the river is a trickle, you know, and it's creating all sorts of problems. And when you try and engage with people in discussions of the purpose of the environment and the purposiveness of the environment, it's very hard within the logic of capitalism to recognize that you drain something to the point of you no longer being able to produce anything is worse for you than recognizing that you can't make as much from it. That kind of real limit, you know, the real limits of the place you're in. And this is something that Māori understand very intimately with their environment, and something that I understand very intimately with my environment too. But the desire of the capitalist is the desire to make sense of things that are nonsensical. The internal contradiction is a site of exposition. You can make money from the contradiction. You know, this is hence the weight cycling thing. I can invest in Weight Watchers as the same time as I can invest in McDonald's. I can do, you know, Coca-Cola. I can do both sides of that. It doesn't matter that they contradict the other side of that coin, which is everyone should be within the healthy weight range of the BMI. You know, I often talk about to the mainstream scientific and nutritionist dietitian community. Imagine a world where everybody is in the, you know, within the normal range of the BMI. That means there's no All Blacks, you know, there's none, not one member of our national rugby team in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is within the healthy weight range of the BMI. They're all overweight or obese. You know, Jonah Lomu was in stage 2 obesity, despite being ripped with muscle, because the BMI doesn't work like that. But they will still come back on that because it makes sense in relation to the production of something. So, okay, but getting back to the relationality, for me, the relationship is with the whakapapa of the environment. I have a relationship with the mountains and a relationship with the river and a relationship with the land. And I want to bring humans with me in that. So one of the training techniques that I'm planning for around this area is to take people. I'm going to begin teaching boxing soon. I'm building an outdoor gym at the moment, and I'm going to start teaching boxing soon. And I'm going to take people into the mountains first, because I want them to connect with the mountains, to connect with the river, and then to connect with the boxing. So to me, that you understand more the relation with other people through your relationship with the environment. But yeah, early days for that on me.
I'll come to your class. That sounds awesome.
We should all book our next flight to New Zealand and join Andrew's outdoor boxing gym. That sounds great.
I have to say though, it's very cold here in winter.
We'll be moving, so you know we'll be fine. I think we've got maybe time for one more question. If there's any final question or comment by anyone.
I think Kim.
Hello.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go on.
Okay. Well, I kind of just happened into this through Molly, word of mouth kind of thing, but it's remarkable. The reason I came is because both of my children are going through very complex realities. One, for the last year and a half, has been struggling with anorexia nervosa. And the other one is a trans boy who has been diagnosed with OED and GAD. And, you know, I hear a big piece of the genetic piece not really being talked about here when we talk about these cycles or where anorexia nervosa comes from and all these things. But in talking with my eldest, who suffers from anorexia nervosa, she came up with this brilliant thing that I felt kind of encapsulates what you're talking about, which is that, you know, eating disorders are genetic in our family. And she was saying that anorexia is like, you have this idea of a feeling, an idea of what your body should feel like. And capitalism delivers you an image for what that feeling is. And when she said that, I was floored because I'd never really understood that that's what it is that's working on the brain, is the coldness, the skeletal state, the death drive, all these things are not something that you can train yourself to do. It's definitely a genetic reality for these people, and that capitalism backs it up is the most horrific reality for a family like ours. And then pointing to the birth issues, as Andrew was saying, for these generalized anxiety disorders. I'm just so curious about your research and what you are working on, dealing with my trans boy, and very serious OCD is also genetic. I'm learning a lot about genetics, and then seeing how our world backs it up, basically encourages, thwarts. I mean, it goes on. So I don't know what that is. I just felt very compelled to thank Molly, my new friend, and Andrew. I loved hearing both of you speak, and it speaks deeply to me. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, firstly, Kim, I understand, I recognize, where you're coming from. This is, I don't have any answers, obviously, in relation to specific things, but I do have some things to say. So my first degree is in biochemistry. So one thing that really fascinates me is the role of epigenetics and the relationship, the interaction between the environment and our and the makeup of our genetic pool. So part of the work I'm doing around the sociology of neonatal encephalopathy involves looking at this really interesting emerging research around perinatal difficulty, perinatal compromise, issues around birth, and the genetic influence that has. So the triggering of certain gene expression pathways, the methylation of genes that results in the certain expressions. So the body then interacts with the world in a different way. The capital W world that Molly talks about.
Yeah.
There's an excellent example of this in what's often called the Danish famine study, where post-World War II, there was a group of women who were living through a famine and were pregnant. And when the researchers followed up their children, 50 years later, they were larger, they're physically larger. The researchers will call that obesity because they measure it by BMI, but I always use the word obesity with quotation marks because it doesn't tell us much about the subject. They were physically larger, they were more likely to have diabetes, all in relation to how they were during that perinatal period. Now, the danger with this, and we've had this in New Zealand, where our chief science advisor to the Prime Minister, the previous Prime Minister, not Jacinda Ardern, but John Key, basically said, oh, we don't need to worry about humans that are born, you know, they're broken, we can't fix that. We have to worry about what mothers, pregnant women do. We need to put all of our attention on pregnant women and how they eat and what they're doing. And they became this kind of hyper focus on this one tiny aspect and caused a great deal of harm in relation to the way that the capitalist requirement to be a pregnant person in the world, you know. So many of us in the kind of health sociology community were found that very abhorrent because of the craziness that it meant, you know. And once again blaming mothers, once again blaming women, you know, the standard kind of patriarchy, particularly women of color, you know, Maori and Pacific women and Aotearoa particularly. But I don't deny that there's a very strong genetic and epigenetic relational aspect to the way that we interact with our environment. And I think that the job of us in the kind of broader psychoanalytic community is to recognize that and to work with the scientific community so that we can help them understand that their answers, the genetic answers, are not answers for the subject. Yeah. Molly, do you?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, and also, you know, in my position, I need to learn from scientists, you know, I need to incorporate that sort of thinking into as I sit with my patients, right? Because I have people who come to me with these exact experiences, or proximal to. And I think about Sylvia Wynter, you know, who talks about human being as a praxis, right? That we're biological and sociological. We're a multiverse. I don't know if that's not her word, but you know, we have multitudes, and so to foreclose on or eliminate any particular aspect in favor of the thing we know best or like that resonates best, I think can be sort of I find it to be a curious sort of place we might go when we're feeling, you know, like when we need an answer, as we do with our children and with the things that we're afraid of. And, you know, speaking for myself, when there's a question I don't know the answer to, right? It's like kind of being able to be in that emergent space. And so I don't want to foreclose on anything biological, right? I don't want to foreclose on anything that's genetic. Because I don't know, but I also, what I do know is that how much we are impacted by our environments, and how reticent our environments tend to be in response to our desire and need and you know, vitality, if it doesn't fit into like a certain prescribed thing. So thank you, Kim, for coming and for sharing that.
The generationality of it all is really fascinating to me, and how, you know, mental health can be something that is passed down through this long line. And to say what you're speaking to about the environment, like, you know, great grandmothers in my lineage had eating issues, and yet no one had the death drive that my daughter has. So it has definitely curved in the direction of worse as it's being passed down. My sister and I, prior to my daughter too. However, what Vivian suffers from is yeah, I'm speechless to it. It's something. Luckily, she's extremely intelligent, so she has a way of speaking about it that is profound and very helpful to the people around her. Anyhow, I could talk about it forever. I just find it really fascinating, your guys' work, and how it informs my own thinking when I'm looking at the things that I'm diving into with all of this stuff. And I now know why I was called to come to your talk today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we could go on talking about these issues for many more hours, but we're sort of at the end of this talk. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much, Andrew and Molly, for really fascinating submissions to begin with, and then really great talks and really great dialogue. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks for your questions. As we said in the beginning, this has only been the first of a series, so this is just the beginning. There'll be more Counterspace events coming up, and we will share them. Next one is probably going to happen. I think we set it for September, didn't we? So we'll share the information when we have all the details sorted out. So thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.